In the final days of August 1945, as the smoke of atomic devastation still hung heavy over Japan, a profound transformation was about to unfold in the hearts of those who had survived the unthinkable. What happened when Japanese women, traumatized by years of propaganda depicting Allied soldiers as monsters, came face to face with the reality of British occupation forces, would shatter everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies and about themselves. This is not just a story about war ending. This is a story about the precise moment when humanity pierced through the iron curtain of hatred, when tears of terror transformed into tears of recognition, and when the most unexpected act of grace rewrote the narrative of an entire nation's understanding of mercy, dignity, and what it truly means to be human. Before we dive deep into this extraordinary tale of transformation, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever experienced a moment that completely shattered your perception of someone you thought was your enemy. The importance of what unfolded in those first encounters between Japanese civilians and British Commonwealth forces cannot be overstated. For years, the Japanese people had been fed a relentless diet of propaganda. Images of Western soldiers as brutal savages who would show no mercy to the defeated. Women were told to hide, to flee, to take their own lives rather than face capture. Mothers clutched their children in the darkness of bomb shelters, whispering prayers and preparing for the worst. The cultural shame of defeat, combined with genuine terror of what occupation would mean, created a psychological atmosphere so thick with dread that entire communities considered mass suicide preferable to surrender. And yet, what actually happened in those first days after Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement would prove to be one of history's most profound demonstrations of how deeply wrong we can be about those we've been trained to hate, and how a single act of unexpected kindness can demolish years of carefully constructed walls between human hearts. The woman at the center of our story, though her real name has been lost to the protective anonymity of post-war records, appears in multiple survivor accounts and British military diaries under the simple designation of Nurse Akiko. She was not just any nurse. Before the war consumed everything, Akiko had been trained at one of Tokyo's most prestigious medical schools, a rare achievement for a woman in 1930s Japan. Her father, a physician who had studied briefly in London, had instilled in her not just medical knowledge but a curiosity about the wider world that made her unusual among her peers. She spoke fragments of English, learned secretly from her father's medical textbooks, a skill she had hidden during the war years when speaking the enemy's language could mean imprisonment or worse. By August 1945, Akiko was working in what remained of a rural hospital outside Hiroshima, tending to burn victims with supplies that had run out weeks ago, watching patients die from injuries she knew were treatable if only she had access to proper medicine. The hospital was little more than a skeleton of a building, its windows blown out, its walls pocked with shrapnel, its corridors filled with the moans of the dying, and the quiet sobbing of those who had lost everything. When word came that British Commonwealth forces would be arriving in their prefecture as part of the occupation, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The hospital director, an elderly doctor named Tanaka, who had served in the Russo-Japanese War decades earlier, called an emergency meeting. His hands trembled as he addressed the remaining staff, a mixture of exhausted nurses, volunteer civilians, and teenage boys too young to have been conscripted before surrender. Dr. Tanaka's voice was hollow as he repeated what everyone had heard through military broadcasts and whispered rumors for years. The foreign soldiers would show no mercy. They would desecrate everything sacred. Women especially were in mortal danger. He suggested that female staff evacuate to the mountains immediately, that they disappear before the occupation forces arrived. The silence that followed his announcement was deafening. Akiko watched as several young nurses began weeping, as two elderly volunteers simply collapsed in exhaustion and despair. But something in Akiko's medical training, something in those fragments of her father's stories about his time in England, something in her core understanding of human anatomy and suffering, whispered a question she dared not speak aloud. Could the soldiers who were coming really be as monstrous as they had been portrayed? Were men who studied medicine in universities, who had systems of law and hospitals of their own, truly the demons of propaganda? Yet even as doubt flickered in her mind, fear was the dominant emotion. That night, Akiko barely slept. She thought of her father, killed in the Tokyo firebombing. She thought of her younger sister, lost in Hiroshima 2 weeks earlier. She thought of the patients under her care who couldn't be moved, who would be completely defenseless when the occupation forces arrived. And she made a decision that would alter the course of her life and become a turning point recorded in the forgotten margins of history. She would stay. She would remain with her patients, whatever the cost. If death or dishonor awaited, she would face it with the dignity her father had taught her a physician must maintain even in the darkest circumstances. It was a decision born not of courage, she would later say, but of exhaustion, of having nothing left to lose, of the medical oath transcending even fear of the enemy. The antagonists in this story were not individuals, but rather the accumulated weight of years of propaganda, the embodiment of mutual hatred that war creates, and the specific manifestations of that hatred in the form of certain Japanese military holdouts and rigid traditionalists who could not accept the new reality. But there were also the British soldiers themselves, or rather the spectre of what Japanese civilians believed British soldiers to be. Among the actual British Commonwealth forces approaching the region was a complex mix of men. Some were hardened combat veterans who had fought brutally. Across Burma and the Pacific, men who had seen their comrades tortured and killed, who carried their own hatred of the Japanese military. Others were young conscripts who had never fired a shot in anger, boys from Manchester and Sydney and Auckland who were terrified of what they might find in this foreign land. And then there was the man who would become central to this story, though his role was initially obscured by the chaos of those first days. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore of the ASIAZ, British Indian Medical Corps. Whitmore was an enigma wrapped in a contradiction. On paper, he was exactly what one might expect from a British colonial officer, Cambridge-educated, from a military family, proper to the point of seeming stiff, a man who followed regulations with precision. He had overseen field hospitals across Southeast Asia, had witnessed atrocities on both sides, and had every reason to approach his assignment with the cold detachment of a man who had seen too much suffering. His orders were clear and limited. Establish medical order in the occupied territories, ensure disease didn't spread among occupation forces, maintain minimal standards for civilian populations to prevent humanitarian catastrophe that might complicate the occupation. Nothing in his orders mentioned compassion. Nothing required him to see the defeated Japanese as anything more than a logistical problem to be managed. And yet, Whitmore carried with him a secret that none of his subordinates knew. A piece of his history that would prove crucial in the transformation about to unfold. Before the war, in what seemed like a different lifetime, Whitmore had spent 2 years in Japan as a young medical student, part of an exchange program between Cambridge and Keio University in Tokyo. He had studied under Japanese professors, had lived with a Japanese host family, had fallen in love with aspects of Japanese culture, art, poetry, and philosophy that seemed impossibly distant from the brutal military regime that had plunged Asia into war. That young medical student had even begun learning Japanese calligraphy from an elderly sensei, had attended tea ceremonies, had believed genuinely in the possibility of East and West understanding each other. Then war had erupted. His Japanese friends had vanished into the machinery of militarism, and the gentle culture he had glimpsed had been buried under years of propaganda from both sides. British media portraying all Japanese as fanatical. Subhumans, Japanese media portraying all Westerners as barbaric demons. The Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore of 1945 had learned to bury that earlier version of himself, to do his duty without sentiment. But the memories remained, hidden like Akiko's secret English, waiting for a moment that might never come. When the British convoy finally rolled into the town where Akiko's hospital stood, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. The few remaining civilians had shuttered their homes, hiding in darkened rooms or fleeing to the countryside. The streets were empty except for the rubble of American bombing raids and the skeletal remains of buildings. An eerie silence blanketed everything, broken only by the rumble of military vehicles and the cautious footsteps of soldiers who expected ambush at any moment, even though the war was officially over. Whitmore's medical unit had been assigned to assess the civilian hospital and determine what resources would be needed to prevent epidemic disease. As his jeep pulled up to the hospital's damaged entrance, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The same sensation he experienced before entering any new area of devastation. He had learned not to expect much, certainly not to expect gratitude or cooperation. His translator, a British Indian corporal named Singh, who spoke functional Japanese, climbed out beside him, adjusting his rifle nervously. Inside the hospital, Akiko had gathered the remaining staff, those few who had chosen to stay or had no ability to flee. They stood in the main corridor, a ragged line of exhausted, terrified people in stained uniforms, surrounded by patients lying on floors because there were no beds left. The air thick with the smell of untreated wounds and inadequate sanitation. When the doors opened and British soldiers entered, weapons ready, the reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Several nurses gasped. One began sobbing uncontrollably. An elderly orderly dropped to his knees with his hands over his head. The patients who were conscious enough to understand what was happening began crying out, some in pain, others in terror. The tension was palpable, a living thing that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Every person in that corridor believed they were witnessing the beginning of the horrors they had been promised were coming. Whitmore entered slowly, deliberately removing his officer's cap in a gesture he hoped might signal non-aggression. His eyes, trained by years of medical work, immediately began assessing not threats but needs, the physician's instinct overriding the soldier's caution. He saw the inadequate bandages, the signs of infection, the malnutrition, the exhaustion. He saw people who needed help, not enemies to be subdued. And then his gaze found Akiko, standing at the front of the group with her back straight despite her obvious fear. Her nurse's uniform torn and stained but worn with dignity, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of terror and defiance that he recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had decided to face death with honor. In that instant, something shifted in Whitmore's carefully controlled demeanor. This was not an abstract problem to be managed. These were individuals, professionals like himself, trying to maintain human dignity in the ruins of catastrophe. Corporal Singh stepped forward to translate, but before he could speak, Whitmore did something that violated every protocol of military occupation. He bowed. Not a casual nod, but a proper formal Japanese bow, holding it for the appropriate length of time. A gesture he had learned years ago in that different lifetime when he had been a student trying to understand a foreign culture. The silence in the room shifted quality, from terror to shock, from shock to utter confusion. The nurses stared, unable to process what they were seeing. A British officer, the embodiment of the conquering enemy, showing respect according to their own cultural customs. It made no sense. It did not fit the narrative of demonic foreigners coming to destroy everything. Akiko felt tears spring to her eyes, though she didn't yet understand why. Something was breaking inside the armor of her expectations. Whitmore spoke then, his Japanese rusty and accented but unmistakable, the words clearly costing him effort to recall after years of suppression. He introduced himself not as Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore of His Majesty's forces, but simply as Dr. Whitmore, a physician who had come to help if help was needed. He asked in careful Japanese if there was someone in charge of medical operations who could show him what supplies they required. The reaction rippled through the corridor like a shockwave. He spoke their language. He called himself a doctor first, soldier second. He asked permission rather than issuing commands. Everything about the moment contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. Dr. Tanaka, who had witnessed the Russo-Japanese War and understood military occupation, stepped forward with trembling legs, his worldview cracking visibly. He began to speak in Japanese, assuming the British officer's language skills were limited, explaining that they had no supplies, no medicine, that patients were dying for lack of basic antibiotics and clean bandages, that he expected nothing from the occupation forces, except perhaps to be arrested for having served the imperial military medical system. What happened next would be described in multiple diaries and letters as the moment everything changed. Whitmore listened to Dr. Tanaka's explanation, nodding with genuine professional concern, then turned to his men and issued rapid orders in English. Within minutes, soldiers were unloading crates from the convoy vehicles, crates marked with red crosses and filled with medical supplies, sulfa drugs, morphine, clean bandages, surgical instruments, rations. Whitmore personally carried a box into the corridor, set it down gently and opened it, showing Dr. Tanaka the contents while explaining through Corporal Singh that these supplies were for the hospital, for the patients, no conditions attached. The elderly Japanese doctor stared at the morphine vials, the precious antibiotics, the clean bandages, as if he were witnessing a miracle that defied the laws of reality. His hands shook as he reached for a package of bandages, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, he broke. Tears streamed down his weathered face. His body shook with sobs, and he dropped to his knees not in surrender but in overwhelmed gratitude that made no sense in the context of war, occupation, and defeat. The emotional dam, once broken in Dr. Tanaka, shattered throughout the room. Nurses who had been rigid with terror began weeping, not from fear now but from the cognitive dissonance of receiving kindness where they had expected brutality, from the relief of realizing their patients might actually survive, from the exhaustion of years of war finally finding a release. Akiko felt her own tears flowing, hot and unstoppable, as she watched British soldiers carefully, almost tenderly, helping to distribute supplies while Japanese staff stood frozen in disbelief. One young British private, who couldn't have been more than 19, noticed an elderly patient struggling to sit up, and instinctively moved to help, supporting the man's back gently while offering him water from his own canteen. The patient, a former teacher who had lost his family in the firebombing, looked up into the face of this foreign soldier with blue eyes and a soft Lancashire accent, and something passed between them that transcended language, enemy status, and the entire brutal architecture of war. They were just two human beings in a moment of simple care, and the teacher began to cry as well, touching the young soldier's hand in gratitude while the private, not knowing what else to do, simply stayed there, holding the water. Canteen steady, his own eyes glistening with tears he didn't fully understand. But the transformation was not immediate or universal. Among the British soldiers were men who struggled with compassion, who had seen too much Japanese military brutality to easily extend mercy, who followed orders to distribute supplies but did so with cold efficiency rather than warmth. Among the Japanese staff were those whose fear remained paramount, who interpreted every British action as a potential trick or prelude to worse violence. The tension between expectation and reality created a volatile psychological space where anything could happen. And it was into this volatile space that the first real conflict emerged. A confrontation that would test everything about the fragile moment of unexpected grace. A Japanese military holdout, a junior officer named Lieutenant Saito who had refused to accept the surrender and had been hiding in the surrounding hills with a handful of loyal soldiers, chose that moment to make his presence known. Saito represented the most rigid, uncompromising element of imperial military culture. A man who believed surrender was the ultimate disgrace, who saw civilians cooperating with occupation forces as traitors worse than the enemy. He appeared at the hospital entrance with 3 armed soldiers, their weapons trained on the British troops, their faces twisted with contempt and rage. Saito's voice rang out with venom as he shouted that the nurses and doctors were dishonoring themselves and their emperor by accepting help from demons, that they should die with dignity rather than become collaborators. His words were designed to shame, to invoke the deepest cultural values of honor, and to weaponize those values against compassion. Several of the Japanese staff visibly flinched, the weight of his accusations landing like physical blows. The British soldiers immediately reached for their weapons, a firefight seeming inevitable in the confined space of the hospital corridor where civilians would certainly be caught in the crossfire. The air became electric with the imminence of violence, all the fragile progress of the last hour threatening to explode into bloodshed that would confirm every worst expectation on both sides. Whitmore raised his hand sharply, commanding his men to hold fire, a decision that put him personally at risk and could have been seen as dereliction of duty. He stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between the British soldiers and the Japanese holdouts, making himself the primary target, a move so unexpected that even Saito hesitated. Whitmore began speaking in Japanese, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority, addressing Saito not as an enemy but as a fellow officer who had sworn oaths to protect life. What Whitmore said in that moment, preserved in Corporal Singh's diary, was extraordinary. He acknowledged Saito's courage in refusing to abandon his principles, acknowledged the depth of loss that Japan had suffered, acknowledged that surrender felt like the death of honor itself. He did not patronize or dismiss these feelings. But then he asked Saito a question that cut to the heart of everything. He asked what honor there was in allowing wounded people to die when medicine was available. What glory there was in forcing nurses to watch patients suffer unnecessarily. Whether the emperor whom Saito claimed to serve would truly want his people to die of infected wounds rather than accept help from former enemies who were now, by the emperor's own decree, offering cooperation. The logic was impeccable, grounded not in Western values, but in the very code of Bushido and duty that Saito claimed to uphold. Whitmore was using the opponent's own framework against him, demonstrating that true honor lay not in rigid pride, but in choosing life and care over pointless death. Saito's face contorted with confusion and rage. He had expected confrontation, expected the British to respond with force or cowardice, expected the civilians to cower in shame at his accusations. Instead, he faced a British officer who spoke his language, who cited principles of Japanese philosophy, who had made himself vulnerable by stepping into the line of fire, and who was arguing that compassion was the higher form of duty. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Akiko watched this exchange with held breath, understanding that the outcome would determine not just whether violence erupted, but whether the possibility of reconciliation could survive at all. She saw something flickering across Saito's face that looked almost like doubt, like the first crack in absolute certainty. But his hand still gripped his weapon, and his men still had their fingers on triggers. Then Whitmore did something that defied not just military protocol, but basic survival instinct. He slowly removed his sidearm from its holster, held it up where everyone could see, and set it on the ground, literally disarming himself in front of armed enemies, while his own men watched in stunned disbelief. He straightened, standing unarmed before Saito, and said quietly in Japanese that if the lieutenant believed the British had come to harm Japanese people, then Saito should shoot him now and prove his point. But that nothing would change the fact that the supplies behind him were meant to save lives, and that his men had orders to continue distribution even if their commanding officer fell. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the labored breathing of patients and the barely audible sobbing of a nurse who thought she was witnessing a man sacrifice himself. Every person in that corridor was frozen, watching an act of moral courage so profound it seemed to bend reality around it. Saito's hands were shaking, his weapon wavering, his certainty crumbling visibly as he confronted the reality that this enemy did not match the image he had been taught to hate. If the British were truly demons, they would have opened fire by now. If they truly intended to destroy Japanese honor, they would not have brought medicine. If this officer were truly a conqueror, he would not be standing there unarmed, vulnerable, offering his life to prove the sincerity of his mission. The logic of hatred was falling apart, and in its wake was something far more terrifying than enemy action. The possibility that everything Saito had believed, everything he had been willing to die for, was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the enemy actually was. Slowly, incrementally, Saito's weapon lowered. His face collapsed into an expression of utter devastation, the look of a man whose entire worldview was shattering. One of his soldiers began weeping openly, the weapon falling from his hands as the psychological exhaustion of years of war finally overwhelmed him. Akiko, witnessing this impossible moment, felt something shift in her own understanding. She stepped forward, her fear overridden by a medical professional's instinct and perhaps something more. A recognition that this moment required someone to bridge the impossible gap between these men. She addressed Saito in Japanese, her voice gentle but firm, explaining that patients were dying in the rooms around them, that children were suffering from infected wounds, that whatever honor meant, it could not mean allowing preventable death. She gestured to the medical supplies, explaining what they contained, what lives they could save. And then she did something extraordinary. She invited Saito and his men to help distribute the supplies, to work alongside the British soldiers in saving Japanese lives, to transform their resistance into service to their own people. It was an offer of redemption that acknowledged their pride while redirecting it towards something constructive. The brilliance of the proposal lay in its recognition that these men needed a way to lay down arms without losing face, needed to serve, without surrendering their identity. Whitmore understood immediately what Akiko was doing and supported it, telling Saito through gestures and simple Japanese that his men would be welcomed as colleagues in the medical work, that there was no shame in choosing life over death. The tension held for what seemed like an eternity. And then Saito did something that witnesses would describe as shocking even in that moment of shocks. He dropped to his knees, his weapon clattering to the floor, and pressed his forehead to the ground in the deepest form of Japanese apology, sobbing with a mixture of shame, relief, and the crushing weight of realizing how close he had come to committing an atrocity against his own people in the name of honor. His men followed one by one, their resistance collapsing not through force but through the undeniable power of an alternative vision, a vision where former enemies could work together to preserve life rather than continue the machinery of death. What